Welcome everyone to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. This is one of Harvard's great intellectual traditions, a tradition that celebrates the outstanding contributions of a single thinker who comes to address us and connects us more closely to one another and the wider world of ideas. The Tanner Lectureship was established at Cambridge University in 1978, and it takes place annually at 9 universities in the United States and abroad. It is named for Obert Clark Tanner. Born in 1904 and raised in a small mountain town in Utah, he was the youngest of 10 children, and he got his entrepreneurial start making class rings in his mother's basement. He went on to become a remarkably successful business owner, the head of the O.C. Tanner Company, a leading manufacturer of recognition awards. Among the simple rules of the company, according to Tanner, was to enjoy living while earning a living. Throughout his lifetime, Tanner took his own directive to heart, broadening the scope of his intellectual and philanthropic interests. A lover of philosophy, he made donations to create philosophy rooms in 11 different college and university libraries. He also generously supported art and art making, most notably through the design and construction of unique fountains, including Harvard's own well-known and award-winning Tanner Fountain. Tanner's was a life, in his words, of adventure and variety, a life distinguished by a profound and abiding concern for the human condition. He saw these lectures, and I quote him again, as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding, he went on to say, may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life. And so we gather annually to seek a better understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. It is an event both welcome and welcoming, and I hope it energizes each of you as it energizes me year after year. I want to thank the Harvard Tanner Faculty Committee for making an inspired choice, and I want to thank the staff of the Mahindra Humanities Center for planning today's event. And now I want to welcome to the podium to introduce our distinguished guest, our own very distinguished Dean of the Law School, Martha Minow.
Thank you, Drew. The Tanner Lectures are a significant event here and at the other institutions where they occur because they remind us all that human values have to be at the center of our inquiry. Brilliant, controversial, and profoundly valuable. These are the words used by one review of Dorothy Roberts' award-winning book, Killing the Black Body. Now a classic work, this 1998 book traces violence against Black women to practices under slavery when white males benefited financially and otherwise by raping Black women, selling their children, and dominating them and their families. Forced hysterectomies, court-ordered contraceptives, soaring rates of sterilization, these are further chapters of the book and the story that she tells. The stigma and the process by which stigma is produced has been the center of attention as Professor Roberts explores how Black women have fought back against the encroachment on their bodies and their self-determination. How stigma operates to make race and gender and marital status and more actual signs, actual realities of subordination. And here's the real trick that she is the expert in exposing: how the processes by which the stigma is produced are erased. How they're erased by the activities of people engaged in good faith and maybe not good faith, in the activities of professionalization, in the activities of claiming to help. Medicine replicates and exacerbates race-based disadvantages. So does law. Internationally recognized as a scholar and a public intellectual and a social justice advocate, Dorothy Roberts, therefore, studies the interplay of gender, race, and class with law as a terrain. She has truly transformed public thinking and policy on reproductive health, child welfare, and bioethics. She has many, many titles. I'm going to say a few of them. She is a professor of Africana Studies, Law, and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She directs the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society. She received the 2015 Solomon Carter Fuller Award from the American Psychiatric Association for providing significant benefit for the quality of life of Black people. She crosses the boundaries between disciplines and between theory and practice. She integrates knowledge, and that's another one of her titles. Shining light and outrage. She exposed the shatter bonds, the color of child welfare. She pursued in Fatal Invention how science, politics, and big business recreate race in the 21st century. She's addressed HIV and AIDS. She's addressed maternal and child health. She is, I am proud to say, a graduate of the Harvard Law School, as well as of Yale University. And she also works in policy, chairing the Black Women's Health Imperative, working with the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, serving on advisory boards, and more. I learned that she has not only spoken at NIH and Russell Sage, more importantly, she's done a TED Talk, a really, really good one. And she's a blogger, and she's involved with film. And she understands that for change to happen, every medium has to be used so that more and more people can have the tools to see and challenge racial bias and the replication of the power relationships in the very disciplines and professions that were meant to advance health, truth, and justice. I am privileged to count her as a friend, co-author, alum, and inspiration. Please come up to the podium, our Tanner lecturer.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Faust, for that introduction of the lecture and inviting me, and Martha for your very warm and insightful introduction. Thanks, Homi Baba, for the invitation as well, and to the Mahindra Center for all that you've done to get me here, and the selection committee for selecting me for the lecture. I'm really grateful and honored to have this opportunity to talk about work I've been doing for a long time, but then to think about how it relates to some new developments I haven't had a chance to write about yet. And I'm so happy that you also invited such wonderful respondents to comment, Evelyn Hammonds and Pilar Osorio and Ann Fausto Sterling. I really look forward to your comments and our discussion. What is the relationship between biology and society? This question has set the fundamental framework for science for more than a century. At the close of the 19th century, scientists like British biologist Francis Galton, also known as the father of eugenics, created a wall between these two realms by separating nature, the biological, from nurture, the social, and then claiming that the unequal social order was caused by the difference in biological traits that socially privileged and socially disadvantaged people were born with. Today, science is undergoing a spectacular paradigm shift that's radically altering the way we understand this basic boundary between biology and society. In fact, the boundary is kind of exploding. Dramatic new knowledge acquired over the last several decades about the way genes function renders untenable the view that heredity can be separated from society. More than that, discoveries about epigenetics, brain function, and the microbiome, among other things, demonstrate that the social environment profoundly affects biological processes so that society actually becomes embodied. Now, some scholars have heralded this biosocial moment as a clean break from the past schism between biology and society. I'd like to reframe this revolution in science to scrutinize how it departs from old biosocial thinking, but also to look at how it drags along parts of the past. To begin with, it's not true that the old paradigm ignored the interplay between biology of human beings and the societies they live in, whereas the new biosocial science embraces it. Scientists using both paradigms, what I'm calling the old and the new, investigate the connection between biology and the social order and employ biological knowledge to improve society. Even before they discovered the gene, scientists in Europe and the United States supported unjust social hierarchies by claiming they were biologically determined. For example, Thomas Jefferson. We could call him a biosocial scientist. He was a naturalist as well as a politician and a statesman, and a political philosopher. And he approached the question of slavery from both a biological and a social point of view. In Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1781, Jefferson explained that, quote, the real distinctions which nature has made, close quote, between blacks and whites made it impossible for them to live together as equal citizens. This unfortunate difference in color and perhaps of faculty, he wrote, is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Mainstream science now largely disavows, but not completely, the old biosocial ways of thinking like eugenics, evolutionary explanations for gender inequality, and biological concepts of race as profound misinterpretations of the relationship between biology and society that we now know have supported horrific acts of inhumanity. The emerging biosocial science investigates instead the impact of social environments on human bodies. Rather than explain social inequality as biologically predestined, these scientists show how social inequality produces disparate biological outcomes. Now, to simplify and emphasize the distinction I'm making, and this is simple, it's more complex than this, but just to get out the idea of this basic distinction I'm making between the old and the new, one posits that biological differences produce social inequality, while the other that social inequality produces biological differences. It's this inversion of the causal relationship between biology and social inequality that distinguishes what I'm going to call the old biosocial and the new biosocial sciences. The distinction I'm making revolves around their theories for explaining the relationship between biology and society. And that's a distinction that's not bound by historical timeframes or academic disciplines. Relating the biological to the social, then, is not itself antiquated or modern, it's not scientific or unscientific, it's not just or unjust. We must ask, what are the values underlying differing approaches to the relationship between biology, society, and justice? Can we identify the features of biosocial ideologies and practices that make them ethical or unethical? Can this analysis help to ensure that the new biosocial revolution doesn't repeat the injustices of the past? Without this scrutiny of its assumptions, methods, and indeed its values, the new biosocial science, like the old, risks reinforcing rather than contesting today's unjust social order. In today's lecture, I'll examine the ethical flaws of the old biosocial science. Tomorrow, I'll examine the ethics of the new biosocial science by testing to what extent it replicates or contests the errors I identified today. Now, let me say a few words about the contours of my scientific and ethical inquiry. First, the science. Biosocial science spans a gigantic and expanding range of research projects that explore the complex interactions between the social environment and human biology. Just as we were waiting to come into this lecture, it was pointed out that there's a whole section of biosocial science I've left out. There's not time enough to cover it all. But I'm particularly interested in some of these scientific projects that claim to explain the relationship between biology and social inequality in particular. Second, the ethics. In the decades following World War II, the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report established ethical standards to help govern science going forward in an effort to prevent the atrocities that many scientists committed in the past, especially the Nazi regime prior to World War II. Biosocial research raises a number of ethical issues. How should scientists protect the autonomy of research subjects whose blood is drawn, cheeks swabbed, and brains scanned? What about the privacy of the biosocial and social data they collect, store, and analyze? What are valid and invalid uses of all this biosocial information by courts, insurance companies, and government agencies? These are all fascinating and important questions biosocial researchers must address, but I want to evaluate the ethics of biosocial science according to the principle I think is most at stake in scientists' claims about biology and social inequality, and that is the principle of justice. Justice is achieved when our society's institutions respect everyone's human rights equally and don't systematically distribute advantages such as education, healthcare, and housing, and disadvantages such as police profiling, incarceration, and pollution to groups of people according to their positions in hierarchies of power. I'm evaluating both the old and the new biosocial sciences according to this ethical principle of justice, although I recognize that the meaning of justice is unsettled and that old biosocial science emerged before it was widely accepted that scientists should be governed by ethical principles at all. I'm not interested in judging biosocial scientists for violating the set of principles that governed them at the time. I'm interested in examining how the assumptions, theories, and methods have advanced or impeded the moral norm of justice. My objective isn't to denounce science that investigates the interplay of biology and society. I support that science, but I want to think more strategically and imaginatively about how it can proceed in a way that actually achieves its asserted aim to reduce social inequalities. To advance an ethical future of science, I'll conclude tomorrow, we need a more radical rethinking of the relationship between biology, society, and justice. So let me begin with the scientific invention of race as a biological division of human beings as an example of the old biosocial science, because it's such a foundational form of this scientific paradigm. Embedded in the biological concept of race is the claim that the inherent characteristics of individuals determine their status in society. European typologists invented race and claimed it was a biological trait rather than a political relationship in order to justify European subjugation of other peoples through conquest, slavery, and colonialism. Transported to revolutionary America, the biological concept of race served an important ideological function. Biological differences were essential to justifying the enslavement of Africans in a nation founded on a radical commitment to liberty, equality, and natural rights. White Americans had to explain Black subjugation as a natural condition, not one they imposed by brute force for the nation's economic profit. Genetic determinism, the theory that genes program individuals' phenotypes, including their behaviors and abilities, is often conflated with the old biosocial science. But race preceded genetic determinism. The belief that race is part of nature profoundly influenced Western biological and social sciences and shaped their understanding of the relationship between biology and society. Evolutionary biologist Joseph Graves points out that biological determinism, in fact, predates not only the 20th century disciplines of evolution and genetics, but even the 19th century formation of biology as a science. Biological determinism, he writes, survived and flourished during the turnover from supernaturalist to scientific explanations of human origins and potential. The biological race concept is a creationist belief that has amazingly survived major scientific revolutions since the Enlightenment, and in fact, survives today in some of the most advanced genomic and biomedical research. The trial judge who convicted the Lovings in 1959 for violating Virginia's ban on interracial marriage explained, Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. His view mirrors the scientific understanding of race as an innate attribute produced by human evolution that exists prior to and separate from society. The resilience of the creationist concept of biological races surely was critical to the transmission of the creationist concept of biological determinism into modern science. Making race revolve around biology constructed it as an innate, permanent, and inescapable status. In a respected text, Anthropology, Biology, and Race, first published in 1923 and then reprinted in 1948 and 1963, the influential anthropologist Alfred Kroeber stated the nature of race as a matter of hereditary fact. Quote, "To the question of why a Louisiana Negro is black and long-headed, the answer is ready. He was born so. As cows produce calves, and lions cubs, so Negro springs from Negro and Caucasian from Caucasian. We call the force at work heredity. As an inherited status, race seems just to be passed down simply through the biological process of procreation. But because race is actually a political category, white lawmakers never left reproducing it to heredity alone. One of America's very first laws, enacted in Virginia in 1662, helped to determine racial boundaries by regulating the inherited status of children. So the law notes this biosocial quandary. To quote the preamble to the law, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, then the statute goes on. What do we do about this problem? The statute clarified the matter by conveniently declaring that the children's status followed the condition of their enslaved mother. So black women gave birth to enslavable children even if their fathers were white. White settler colonists altered English laws of inheritance and kinship to devise the delusion that enslaving their own children followed the laws of nature. The biological claim that race is inherited cast black women's bodies as the producers of their children's subjugated political position. Centering the reproduction of slave status on black women's wombs served dual purposes. It excused state violence against black women as necessary to manage their procreative labor, which produced the property needed to maintain the slave system, and at the same time, it attributed the suffering slavery inflicted on Black people to the inferior qualities Black women supposedly transmitted to their offspring. Medical researchers of the day elaborated the claim that race is inherited by investigating racial differences in disease. The racial concept of disease, that people of different races suffer from different diseases and experience common diseases differently, was presented as proof not only that race is biological, but that biological distinctions between races, particularly Black pathology, caused racial inequality. After attending the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, Dr. Samuel Cartwright practiced in the Deep South in the 1850s and became a well-known expert on what was then called Negro medicine. Cartwright argued that slavery was beneficial for Black people for medical reasons. He claimed that because Black people had lower lung capacity than whites, forced labor was good for them. He wrote in a medical journal, "It is the red vital blood sent to the brain that liberates their minds when under the white man's control. And it is the want of sufficiency of red vital blood that chains their minds to ignorance and barbarism when in freedom." By converting race into biological difference, Cartwright made enslavement of Africans seem like a form of freedom and made Black freedom seem like bondage. After slavery ended, white scientists blamed Black people's deteriorating health on a biological incapacity to adjust to freedom. Locating Blacks' inferior status and biological susceptibility to the changing social environment provided a reason to retain white supremacy. Instead of dismantling the social order inherited from slavery, scientists argued that the best way to improve the condition of emancipated Blacks was through either benign neglect or coercive medical intervention. This updated biosocial theory excluded from scientific inquiry, at least for the mainstream scientists, the reality that at the time, whites were violently reinstating Black people's slave status through Ku Klux Klan terror, the convict lease system, and voter disenfranchisement. Just as Cartwright explained the symptoms of Black oppression as caused by race-specific disease, so he explained Black resistance as a symptom of race-specific disease. Cartwright coined the term drapetomania, combining Greek words for runaway slave and crazy to describe the mental disorder that caused enslaved Blacks to flee plantations. Because, after all, if enslavement was good for Black people's health, then an enslaved person would have to be crazy to run away from it. A biologically normal Black person should be happy to be enslaved. Just as Cartwright corrected for race in his measurement of human lung function, by the way, a practice that continues in medicine today, he corrected for race in his understanding of human freedom. In a speech to the National Press Club in 1986, James Baldwin pointed out that the noble savage of Africa had to become the happy darky in the Americas. To quote Baldwin, "If I wasn't happy, then there was something wrong with slavery. So I had to be happy to keep the master happy." Baldwin goes on to note the moral and epistemological perversion entailed in the racial delusions needed to make the master happy. We are living with these myths until today, and it corrupts the view from here, he said. Out of this profound misapprehension has come a system of thought which makes reality very hard to reach. Scientists invented the concept of race as an inherited trait that naturally produces and reproduces the racial order in which Black people serve white masters. With this system of biosocial thought, scientists kept white people happy by helping them avoid the reality of their nation's origins in violence against Black people. Now I want to turn to a more recently developed yet closely related biosocial science that emerged after the discovery of the gene. In 1911, prominent biologist Charles Davenport, who I mentioned University of Pennsylvania, so I'll mention Harvard. He was a biology professor at Harvard at one point. Equal opportunity here. Davenport defined eugenics as the science of the improvement of the human race by better breeding. At the turn of the 20th century, scientists proposed the rational control of reproduction to improve the population and advance society, based on the premise that genes determine individuals' socially relevant traits. Eugenicist biosocial agenda, which spanned a broad range of public health, criminal justice, education, and immigration policies, confused social privilege with innate biological superiority and social disadvantage with innate biological inferiority. The founder of eugenics, Francis Galton, mistook inherited social privilege for inherited intelligence when he wrongly assumed that the British elite achieved their stature owing to what he called their innate genius. He argued that fitness in humans depended on general ability or intelligence and proposed to show that a man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance. Like the myth that racial caste is inherited, Galton's claim that social class is inherited is a profound misapprehension that erases the reality of violently enforced structural inequality. Galton's distinction between nature and nurture laid the foundation for his biological theory of social class. By separating nature, the traits that children are born with, from nurture, everything that influences children after they're born, Galton could claim that children's social positions are determined by their inherited traits and not by the social structures that advantage or disadvantage them. This imaginary break between nature and nurture permitted eugenicists to avoid the obvious empirical problem of controlling for the myriad impacts social inequality has on children's experiences and life chances. As the Geneticists Manifesto, signed by 22 scientists and published in Nature in 1939, noted, there can be no valid basis for estimating and comparing the intrinsic worth of different individuals, that means intelligence, without economic and social conditions which provide approximately equal opportunities for all members of society, instead of stratifying them from birth into classes with widely different privileges. The make-believe that scientists can isolate, test for, and quantify inherited propensities that determine success in an unequal society scaffolded eugenicists' claim that social inequality originates in biology. Right? There is no way to prove that anyone's social position is caused by inherited traits in an unequal society. You can do it in a lab with rats, maybe, but you can't do it with human beings. Galton's eugenicist ideas found fertile ground in America. Eugenics became mainstream science in the United States before it was embraced as the biosocial logic of Nazi extermination. Like the biological concept of race, eugenics was politically useful to defend the white capitalist regime. In the early 1900s, the descendants of Northern European settlers sought to maintain control over an exploited workforce of Southern Black sharecroppers and urban factory workers from Southern and Eastern Europe. Eugenics provided a forward-looking scientific framework to justify the efforts of white elites to preserve the unjust social order they had violently erected. White elites were also pathologically obsessed with preserving their racial purity. And eugenicist science went hand in hand with Jim Crow laws that officially segregated people by race. Eugenics and Jim Crow, after all, were progressive reforms that relied on modern biosocial science to strengthen the social order. On the same day in March 1924, the Virginia legislature enacted 2 laws that jointly promoted the state's eugenicist and white supremacist agendas. Virginia's anti-miscegenation law, the Racial Integrity Act, prohibited anyone who wasn't white from marrying a white person in order to discourage contamination of the white race from racial mixing, and to reserve for white people only the privileges of marriage to a white person. That was the law that the US Supreme Court held unconstitutional finally in 1967 in the Loving versus Virginia decision. Now, along with that act, Virginia lawmakers passed an act to provide for the sexual sterilization of inmates of state institutions in certain cases. And that authorized the forced sterilization of people confined to government asylums because they were deemed feeble-minded. The compulsory sterilization law was the subject of the 1927 case, Buck versus Bell, in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes gave eugenicist science the imprimatur of constitutional law in his infamous declaration, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Like Samuel Cartwright's defense of slavery and the myth of the happy darky, Justice Holmes's rationale for sterilizing Carrie Buck against her will relied on the pretense that the state's violation of her body was for her own good, as well as society's. Holmes explained, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Eugenicist science provided a biological explanation for Carrie's disadvantaged status as one of the, quote, shiftless, ignorant and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South, to quote Harry Laughlin's deposition testimony in the case, and it gave them a biological excuse to forcibly contain her. According to eugenicist thinking, forced sterilization protected society from the biological threat posed by genetically defective races and classes. The biosocial logic of race and eugenics not only obscures the violence required to uphold structural inequality, it converts those subjected to state violence into biological threats to society. Frantz Fanon wrote in The Negro and Psychopathology, the Negro symbolizes the biological nature. To suffer from a phobia of Negroes is to be afraid of the biological. I recall Fanon's words frequently these days when police officers routinely explain why they killed unarmed black victims by describing them as having threatening non-human bodies. The Charlotte, North Carolina officer who shot 24-year-old Jonathan Farrell 10 times as Farrell approached him for help after his car crashed described him as a zombie. Darren Wilson told the Ferguson grand jury investigating his killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown, the only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. The notion that race is biologically reproduced makes black women's wombs an especially dangerous biological threat. Politicians, policymakers, sociologists, demographers, public health experts, and the media cast black women's fertility as an urgent social problem. They routinely point the finger at black women's childbearing as the cause of their children's disadvantages and deficits, and propose policies to restrict black women's fertility as the remedy. Tens of thousands of black women across the country were sterilized without their voluntary consent in the 1960s and 1970s as part of government programs that viewed their children as burdens on society. The North Carolina Eugenics Board operated well into the 1970s by then focusing the scalpel on Black women who received public assistance. A 1990 Philadelphia Inquirer editorial proposed Norplant, a long-acting chemical contraceptive, as the answer to the staggering rates of Black child poverty. And in 2013, not 1913, the Center for Investigative Reporting revealed that 150 female inmates in California state prisons had been sterilized between 2006 and 2013 without obtaining required ethics approval. The doctor in charge justified sterilizing the incarcerated women by pointing to, quote, what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreated more. He was willing to tell the reporter that. In the 1990s, Black mothers' crack cocaine use became a primary explanation for high rates of both Black infant mortality and child poverty, although these disparities long predated the crack epidemic. Biomedical researchers falsely claimed that these women gave birth to so-called crack babies who lacked any social conscience and were destined to lives of welfare dependency, illiteracy, and crime. Instead of transmitting immutable deficiencies through their genes, these mothers were said to inflict similar damage in utero, dooming the next generation of Black children to what one columnist described as, quote, a life of certain suffering, of probable deviance, of permanent inferiority. The exact biological mechanism by which Black mothers produce their children's inferior status became irrelevant. Another reporter wrote, call them welfare babies, crack babies, or deficit babies, but by whatever term, they constitute a new bio-underclass of infants who are disadvantaged almost from the moment of conception. Since then, medical researchers have definitively discredited the crack baby myth. The infants exposed to crack cocaine in utero have grown up now, and they're not the monsters they were predicted to become. The negative outcomes they exhibited as newborns, originally attributed to drugs, actually resulted from structural inequities experienced by all mothers and children in their neighborhoods: lack of access to high-quality health care, shoddy housing, malnutrition, exposure to environmental toxins, and stress. But the damage had been done. District attorneys across the country concocted an assortment of charges to punish these women for fetal crimes, and child welfare agencies removed thousands of babies from their mothers to warehouse in hospital wards. A public health problem turned into a criminal justice matter to be solved by locking up women instead of providing them with better health care. Over the last several years, an anti-abortion billboard campaign in cities like Atlanta, Chicago, and New York literally reiterated the familiar message that Black women's wombs pose a biological threat. The most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Ironically, these billboards were trying to exploit the history of reproductive abuse of Black women by using rhetoric that comes straight out of the eugenics era. The old biosocial science casts only socially disadvantaged people, never those in power, as biological threats to society. Scientists tend to focus on Black people as research subjects to investigate the innate predisposition for violence and other forms of antisocial behavior. The atrocities white people have systematically inflicted on other human beings are far too numerous and horrific to recite. We need only recall the postcard image of tortured and burned bodies of Black lynching victims hanging from trees as grinning white onlookers point up at them. Yet Black scholars who propose to study the biological reasons for white people's propensity to violence are considered crackpots. Black psychiatrist Frances Cress Welsing's theory of color confrontation, which links white people's urge to dominate others to a genetically defective lack of melanin, is considered, see, that gets a laugh, is considered illegitimate by mainstream biosocial scientists. But why, think about it seriously, why is her theory any less plausible an explanation for the racial order in America and around the world than theories that rely on Black people's genetic defectiveness? The universal condemnation of the Nazi Holocaust put an end to mainstream support for eugenics as empirically and ethically flawed science. But eugenics' biosocial underpinning, the belief that social inequalities originate in biological differences, has survived. The Galton Foundation closed down the Eugenics Review in 1968, only to revive it as the Journal of Biosocial Science the following year. The American Eugenics Society waited until 1973 to change its name to the Society for the Study of Social Biology. Decade after decade, prominent scientists have used eugenicists' favorite measure of inherent worth, intelligence, to make biosocial claims. In the 1970s, Berkeley psychologist Arthur Jensen argued that Black students' innate cognitive inferiority limited the efficacy of federal education programs. There was no point in spending tax dollars in improving education for Black children, he said, because they were innately incapable of greater academic achievement. The 1994 controversial bestseller, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, rehashed the claim that race and class disparities stem from immutable differences in inherited cognitive ability, which could not be eliminated through social interventions. Today, as biological and social scientists gain unprecedented access to research participants' genetic information, they're revisiting eugenicists' claims about intelligence and linking specific genotypes to educational attainment. A study published this year in Molecular Psychiatry claims its findings marked, quote, a turning point in the social and behavioral sciences. Why? Because their findings, they say, make it possible, quote, to predict educational achievement for individuals directly from their DNA. The authors proposed that polygenic scores may soon become a useful tool for early prediction and prevention of educational problems. These scientists aren't using children's social positions to predict their intelligence or their educational attainment as eugenicists did, but they are using genetic tests to explain why socially disadvantaged children achieve less academically. Unlike eugenicists, many researchers currently study the genetics of intelligence and argue that their findings can help to reduce social inequality by identifying through these tests which children need educational interventions the most. But given the persistence of glaring race and class inequities in public education, it seems far-fetched that our society would be more motivated to devote extra rather than even fewer resources on children deemed by tests to be genetically predisposed to lower intelligence. We're more likely to address children's unequal educational attainment by distributing educational resources more equally. World War II also brought the disavowal of scientific racism. UNESCO's landmark 1950 and 1951 statements on race rejected the Nazi doctrine that some races are superior to others, but they failed to abandon the concept of biological race altogether. Instead, scientists began to distinguish the ideological use of race for repressive purposes from the scientific use of biological race for legitimate research. 50 years later, the mapping of the human genome seemed to herald once again the demise of the biological race concept when President Clinton and the scientists involved in the project declared it proved race could not be identified in our genes. Yet the science that emerged from sequencing the human genome reflects just the opposite, an explosion of interest in race-based genetic variation. In many labs, scientists use race as an unquestioned organizing principle for their collection, analysis, and reporting of genetic data, with an astounding lack of scientific rigor, routinely confusing the latest socially determined census categories for genetically determined biological groupings. For example, a study published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2007 attempted to test the hypothesis that, quote, Black race, independent of other factors, increases the risk of extreme preterm births. It's hard to fathom what the researchers meant by Black race and how they could have possibly isolated this ambiguous biological essence from the wide range of environmental factors that can cause women to deliver prematurely. The revival of the biological race concept reached outside academic circles in 2014 when former New York Times science journalist Nicholas Wade published a manifesto in favor of race-based genetics. In A Troublesome Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History, Wade claims that the human species is divided into three principal races: Africans, Caucasians, and East Asians. And he says they evolved separately to be genetically predisposed to distinctive social behaviors that in turn determined the types of institutions each race developed. According to Wade, and you can kind of guess where this is going without reading the book, but just in case you didn't follow the logic, Europeans evolved to create open and innovative societies. Jews are genetically adapted to behaviors required for economic success. Chinese people are programmed for conformity that makes them obedient to autocrats. And Africans remain mired in their innate propensity for violent tribalism. For Wade, it is instinctual social behaviors that explain why resource-poor countries like Japan and Iceland are wealthy, while more richly endowed countries like Nigeria and Haiti are, quote, beset by persistent poverty and corruption. He is breathtakingly silent about the role of European conquest, slavery, and colonialism in producing these global inequities. In several widely cited articles in prominent journals, biomedical researchers argued that it was essential to investigate health-related genetic differences among racial groups in order to treat the health problems of minority patients effectively and equitably. These scientists distinguish their use of race as an inherited trait from its racist incarnations on the basis of their advanced methods and their good intentions. This defense assumes that race is a natural category that only becomes problematic when it falls into the hands of racists. But race is the product of racism. Racism is not the product of race. The problem is that scientists' misinterpretation of the political category supports racism by perpetuating the view that racial inequalities are caused by innate differences rather than unequal power arrangements. The current revival of biological concepts of race mimics past deterministic explanations for racial inequality by making race seem more real at the molecular level than at the social level. Seeing race as an innate trait resolves the current contradiction between a colorblind political ideology that claims racism has ceased to matter in our society and the despicable racial gaps in health, wealth, and welfare that are very plain to see. Yet again, in the words of Evelyn Hammonds, the appeal of a story that links race to medical and scientific progress is in the way in which it naturalizes the social order in a racially stratified society such as ours. Today, this scientific approach to race provides a soothing genetic explanation for the racial inequities that persist in a supposedly post-racial society. So what is the relationship between biology and society? I've argued that the old biosocial science, exemplified by eugenics and the biological concept of race, answers this question in a way that impedes justice. The old biosocial science is grounded in a profound misapprehension of the relationship between biology and social inequality. Brazilian educator Paulo Freire observed in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. Old biosocial scientists have explained the historical fact of dehumanization of oppressed people as a given destiny, rather than the result of unjust power arrangements. This is not just an empirical error, this is an unethical one. The old biosocial science separates nature from nurture in order to locate the origin of social inequality in inherited traits rather than imposed structural societal structures. It theorizes that social inequality is reproduced in the bodies, especially the wombs, of socially disadvantaged people, rather than in the reinvention of unjust ideologies and institutions. It identifies the problems stemming from social inequality as oppressed people's biological threats to society, rather than as the structural impediments and state violence inflicted on oppressed people. And it addresses social problems by intervening in oppressed people's bodies to fix their perceived biological deficits, rather than ending the structural violence that dehumanizes them and maintains the unjust order. The abominable practices that ensued in the past from the old biosocial science, such as forced sterilizations, medical experimentation, internments, and exterminations, stemmed not only from the bad intentions of the scientists who participated in them, but from the unethical logic of the science itself. The old biosocial science, to borrow again the words of James Baldwin, is a system of thought that makes the reality of social inequality and the structural violence that maintains it very hard to reach. With this argument in mind, I'll close today's lecture about the old biosocial science that holds that social inequality is caused by biological differences. Tomorrow, I'll discuss the new biosocial science that investigates how social inequality produces disparate biological outcomes. Is the new biosocial science, I'll ask, a system of thinking that makes the reality of social inequality easier or harder to reach? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Evelyn Hammonds, professor of the history of science and African American studies here at Harvard. And I want to begin by thanking Dorothy for this stimulating and rich opening lecture. Dorothy and I have been traveling for a long time over this same historical terrain, exploring and uncovering the complex ways in which race and science have troubled and destabilized the lives of African Americans in our nation's history. And I'm really honored to have this opportunity to engage with her today and over the next tomorrow as well. Dorothy comes at this topic through her training as a legal scholar, while I do so from the perspective of the history of science and African American studies. So in my comment, I want to emphasize some of the distinctions between our two academic disciplines and the ways in which they approach this long and complicated history. So I'll try to raise a few points that I hope will offer some additional historical context to the many points that Dorothy makes in this lecture, and then I want to raise some questions for our discussion. So first, I think Dorothy's main question, what is the relationship between biology and society is a very, very complex one. And she wants to answer this question by beginning to examine what she calls the old biosocial science, which posits that biological differences produce social inequality, versus the new biosocial science, which posits that social inequality produces biological differences. And she continued that the distinction between the two is not bound by historical timeframes or academic disciplines. But of course, as a historian, I'm going to argue that looking at the historical context is critical to understanding this important distinction she's drawn between the old biosocial sciences and the new. Of course, at the center of these questions is the long history of race in the United States, a history that depends critically on the changing meaning of race over time. In the US, we really don't have time today to discuss the complex changes in how race concepts have been defined differently over time. So what I want to do is sort of briefly weave in a few moments in the history of the race concept that I think illustrate the work that race does in linking biology to society and to issues of social justice in the US context. Third, I just want to say, Dorothy also asked us to think about what is the ethical relationship between biology, society, and justice. And here I will argue in agreement with Dorothy that, quote, without, as she noted, without scrutiny of its assumptions, methods, and indeed values, the new biosocial science, like the old, risk reinforcing rather than tackling, though I would say undoing, today's unjust social order. So let me start with the old biosocial science. I hope that what I have to say is not too redundant, but I'm trying to weave a bit of a narrative here. So of course we begin in the American context with Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century. And of course, he was speaking from a natural philosophical tradition where the classification of races emphasized a hierarchical ranking of humans with Europeans at the top, Africans at the bottom, especially enslaved Africans. This was certainly, his intervention was certainly an important moment in US history because it introduced the issue of African slaves, so-called natural and inherent biological and social inferiority, into our national discourse. And this discourse put front and center the idea that, quote, innate biological differences necessarily reflected innate social differences. But over the course of the 18th and 19th century, there were some significant shifts in scientific beliefs about race due to the rise of scientific medicine, the emergence of formal disciplines of biology and the social sciences, and developments in statistics, anthropology, and psychology. Physicians also played a prominent role in linking race to biology in the 19th century, led by Samuel Cartwright, but certainly not only Samuel Cartwright. Physicians were endless in their comparisons of disease differences between whites and blacks. The historian John Haller notes that physicians simply assumed that there were innate biological, mental, physiological causes for the differences they observed, and they assumed that the cause of differences between whites and blacks was racial, and no further explanation or exploration was needed. Therefore, I would argue that by the end of the 19th century, white physicians had little interest in understanding what we would now call health disparities, because the answer to why such disparities existed was explained by the observed racial differences, which were just a reflection of how African Americans, for example, lived and how they died. In the 19th century, then, race was an indivisible essence where biology and culture were joined. Or as one scholar noted, quote, race was everything, end quote. Moving forward, as George Stocking Jr. noted, quote, by 1900, while there was no generally accepted answer to the question, what is race, for both the scholar and the citizen, race was an integrated, physical, linguistic, and cultural totality. In the 20th century, I would argue that what we have witnessed is how this integrated totality that was race began to unravel. Most significantly, biologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and physicians began to ask similar and different questions about the relationship between biology and society. For example, in the 1920s, leading social scientists, biologists, and anthropologists alike voiced a need to study the Negro again during this period, noting that previous studies conducted in the 19th century were imprecise, ill-defined, and simply could not get to the deeper social or biological problems that the Negro embodied. More modern scientific methods were needed, they claim. There was much discussion at this time about the relative contribution of biological and social processes to heredity. And the Negro was seen as the ideal embodiment of these processes. In 1926, when the National Research Council formally established the Committee on the Study of the Negro, white elites on this committee saw biology as a powerful set of practices that offered a way to solve the social problems presented by the Negro. Now, of course, this perspective was forcefully challenged by the great African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, who was among the first African-American scholars of a long line to follow, to question the ways in which white elites had used biology as the answer to the unequal social conditions that African Americans were forced to endure. Now, certainly, Franz Boas, the anthropologist, and his students in concert with Du Bois distinguished between race, language, and culture, arguing that any biological meaning ascribed to race was nevertheless thoroughly open to social influence. In addition, as Dorothy has noted, the emergence of eugenics was probably the most important set of ideas and practices that codified a naturalistic perspective about US society. And there's much to say about its influence on biology in the US. But I want to make a slightly different point that was first made by the historian Peggy Pascoe. And she noted that historians have described something of a war that happened between the culturalists, represented by anthropologists like Franz Boas and his students, against the eugenicists and the biological determinists. And most histories argue that by World War II, with the excesses of Nazism, the culturalists won and the eugenicists lost. Race was indeterminable biologically, as Boas wrote, quote, "It is not possible to assign with certainty any one individual to a definite group," end quote. Now, some biologists joining his view even argued that races applied to human groups should be dropped from the vocabulary of science. But Pascoe noted that what the culturalists were saying was not that there was no such thing as race, but rather that race was nothing more than biology. It was just differences in phenotype, in blood, hair type, bone, skin, color, and the like. And culture was far more important than these mere biological things. They considered biology to be of little importance in understanding human beings, American society, or any society. So I would suggest that in the post-World War II period, up until the middle of the 20th century, race as biology was under siege in the biological sciences, though, as Dorothy notes, is not so much happening in medicine and public health. Biology in this period was no longer sought after to explain language, custom, intelligence, character, or civilization. Race as biology, as Gunnar Myrdal would argue, was all that was left. And it was meaningful only because the visible physical characteristics used to identify racists were used by racists to sustain racial hierarchies. Meanwhile, I think another point we have to consider is that these were academic discussions and debates about biology and race. Pascoe's and others' analyses of specific court cases offer, I think, one important view, but they also show us that these academic debates had little to do with what was happening outside of the academy on the streets of America. On Main Street America, the link between race and biology was just as total as Stocking described in 1900. Lay people did not need biology to sustain a particular view of race, that it was biological. As Tom Holt argues, quote, this work was done by anti-miscegenation laws, a vigilant state bureau of vital statistics that aggressively enforced racial boundaries, issuing birth and death statistics, census takers, job discrimination, separate school systems, and if all else failed, bloodhounds and lynch mobs, end quote. So I too, like Dorothy, am haunted by the persistent way in which the recent spate of police confrontations with African Americans is permeated with language that describes African Americans as biological and social threats. But such language and imagery, I would suggest too, really reflects the deep sedimentation of race as biology into our national consciousness and interpersonal communication. So to sum up the points I'm trying to make, I suggest that we see race as an ever-changing lens through which the relationship between biology and society has been viewed throughout US history. It is an especially dense transfer point between biology and society, and it reifies the fraught and contested relationships between them. So now I want to turn briefly to the question that Dorothy asked us to think about. What is the ethical relationship between biology, society, and justice? So I want to turn to the historian of biology, Philip Pauley, who argued that by the 1920s, the elite white male leaders of American biology saw their project as an expression of American thoughts, values, anxieties, and aspirations. As such, thinking about biological objects and subjects glided easily for them into thoughts about human society, social evolution, the preservation of threatened species, and the needs to educate and uplift the American public. And Pauley put it this way, quote, biologists have expressed a continued desire to culture American life. It has included not only the preservation of health and combating of disease, but also the enhancement of possibilities for both present and future generations associated with sexual, reproductive, and genetic technologies. Finally, it has entailed efforts more narrowly cultured to present Americans with a naturalistic perspective on life and to persuade them that they are organisms who have the capability to use intelligence to deal with the modern world. These desires, he suggests, have formed foundations for articulating and realizing the promise of American life, end quote. So for Pauley, academic biologists built into the profession this notion that a biologist should be concerned and must be concerned with culturing American life. And I think while Pauley's point is provocative, it does fail to capture that from 1900 well into the late 20th century, race remained a critical object that biologists used to sustain a naturalistic account of social issues in the US, despite changing race relations. And some would suggest that biologists are not primarily interested anymore in questions such as what kind of biological element African Americans are in US society, or the biological character of the American people in the ways that eugenicists were, but now their interest is more in manipulating and improving American society. Their science is linked to technology, industry, and profits more broadly, as Pauley notes. These new practices leaves all views of race unanalyzed in the academy and the streets, where, as biologist Ruth Hubbard quipped, social facts continue to be conflated with natural facts. And Nancy Steppen concurred, noting that there is a complicated circle of meaning and practices that tie the natural human body to the political. Or as Donna Haraway would put it, the political made the natural and the political undid the natural. There's another strain also in post-World War II biology that is perhaps pertinent to Haraway's point, And that's the history that Diane Paul and others have described of politically left geneticists who in the post-World War II period argue that there was a link between biological progress and social progress. These biologists, as Paul notes, argued that, quote, the biological improvement of mankind presupposed the transformation of social relationships. So I don't have time to talk about the long history of the debates among biologists about these ideas, but I think these arguments could provide a way to think about the links between the old biosocial science and the new. So to end, I would return to Dorothy's first question. What is the relationship between biology and society? I want to ask a different question. What kind of relationship do we want between biology and US society, and how can we achieve it if we knew what we wanted? I wonder if we might discuss what the specific ethical issues are for biologists and for US society. Now, my thought is that one direct ethical issue is to consider the locus of control that appears in characterizations of the black body as natural. Characterizations which continually make African Americans responsible for their individual circumstances. In the old biosocial science, there was little room for notions of distributive justice or ethics, since natural states could not be modified, only explained with greater and greater precision by increasingly more powerful biological sciences and scientists. In the end, I guess I ask, who provides answers to the question of what kind of relationship we want to have between biology and society? I hope we can have a discussion first about who's included in the we, and secondly, how we can think about the ways in which we might bring citizens and biologists together to examine the old biosocial science as we walk into the new. Thank you. So I think what happens now is Dorothy gets to say a few words, and then we'll have a discussion with questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Evelyn, for those excellent comments and expansion and elaboration and different perspective on the questions that I was asking and talked about. I think I see our two perspectives as, in a way, being two sides of the same coin, but working together. So I'm looking at the way in which a common way of thinking about the relationship between biology and social inequality traverse these various eras. And that's why I said it's not bound by time. The fact that the eugenics era is supposedly ended at World War II doesn't mean that those ideologies don't persist in science today. So that's what I meant, but my goal was, in a way, to show how a particular philosophy, ideology, way of thinking about the relationship between biology and society has persisted in various forms over various historical periods. And I heard your comments as pointing out the importance, which I absolutely agree with, in looking at how those ideas have taken different forms during different historical periods in response to the particular political and social and cultural conditions of the time. So I think they are both, not to try to be super conciliatory or something, but I think they're both reaching the same conclusion, which is that this is a powerful way of thinking that has had a profound impact on science and society that has persisted and it's persisted in part because it's able to reform in response to society and what's going on in society, and then to even support, it's in response, but also maintaining certain types of relationships in society. All of this is changing, but there is a consistent ideology and perspective on the relationship between society and biology that I think we can discern and distinguish from another paradigm. Even though my goal tomorrow is to look at how that new paradigm is distinguishable and in which ways it continues some of the flaws of the old biosocial science. And when I say flaws, I mean the way in which it has supported unjust relationships in our society. I also want to say as a bit of preview that tomorrow I do take up where you left off, asking more the question, who decides, who's part of the discussion of how we want the relationship between biology, society, and justice to look? Are biological and social scientists up to the task without bringing in other disciplines and people outside of academia to answer these questions? So I will focus on that more tomorrow, and I agree with you, that is a very important question. Who asks and answers these more fundamental questions about the just society we want to envision? And what is the role of science in that? What role will science play? Scientists themselves can't answer that question, all by themselves. So that's something I want to take up tomorrow, and I'm glad that you brought it up tonight. So should we proceed over here now? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, are we on? Questions? Professor Baba.
Thank you both very much for those provocative and interesting views, which are particularly significant because of their interdisciplinarity. And in fact, your final comment was precisely about that. Can you resolve this within the kind of disciplinized areas, or the disciplinary areas, or do you have to go out? My question really is focuses on two issues here. One, which is an open question about the race caste concept of the Chicago School of Sociology. So this is not biosocial sciences, but it is social sciences, right? And the way in which it dealt with the question of the street, as you put it, the main street. So and in that work, as I recall it, of the Chicago School of Sociology, the question of culture is extraordinarily important, and psychodynamics are very important, the whole question of perception. So my second question takes off from the metaphor that Evelyn used, which is about changing the lens, taking a different view, and suggesting that the whole question of perception is on the street, and the way in which projection on the body, on the black body, brings together, in some ways, the cultural, the biosocial, as well as the ethical. And of course, that's the central issue of Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. The kernel of his argument is when a child turns to her mother and says, "Look, a black person, look, a black body." And here you get both the scientific, the biological, and the phenomenological coming together. And I suggest this because of your invitation to think more broadly, that this then leads Fanon, for instance, to try and understand some of the questions that you've raised by turning to phenomenology, very different from the philosophical traditions in which the ethics that you've talked
Yes.
about on the one hand,
Yeah.
and a certain kind of psychoanalysis on the other. So this is just a way of suggesting that the body itself becomes the kind of nexus of projection. And then the notion of the street, or where the encounter, or the racial encounter takes place, is a complex imbrication of some kind of biological common sense and an affective identification.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot there. Tomorrow, I'd want to talk more about the question of disciplinary integration, because the new biosocial science comes with more interdisciplinary work between biological scientists and social scientists. And there is an expectation that merging biological and social sciences is going to produce something radical. And tomorrow I'll question whether that's the case. It's similar to Evelyn's question about who answers these deeper questions, and how do we get to a point of even imagining something beyond the way that scientists have answered these questions in the past. But today I focused mostly on biologists, but it's not the case at all that only biologists have supported and perpetuated these views about race and about the relationship between biology and society. That's part of my comments tomorrow, will be that, in a way, they can come together and support the old views that they both had. Social scientists have used biological explanations as well as biologists for social inequality. But you raised, Homi, another question about the focus on culture as opposed to biology as an explanation for Black people's inferior status in America, or the social problems that Black people experience. And there is, in many Americans' view about race, and this was empirically supported by Anne Morning's research. She's a sociologist at NYU. She looked at not only at biology and anthropology textbooks, but she also interviewed professors and college students. And many of the college students conflated culture and biology as if culture is inherited. They didn't say it in biological terms. In fact, they were taught to say that race is a social construction. It's not an innate biological trait. It's not a natural biological category. But yet when they described why there were differences between Black people and white people, they described culture as if it were inherited. Cultural explanations as if they were inevitable, natural, and inherited. And there are some sociologists who have described culture the same way as well. Now, the point about Fanon's point of encountering the white child, encountering the Black person on the street, and why that evokes a certain response. I wasn't sure if you were suggesting that there is something natural at all about that response. I didn't think you were, but
I'm talking about projection, about how
Yes.
a body image comes to become a visual icon of a certain kind because
Yes,
of these
exactly. But that clearly is because whatever the parent says to the child is going to train the child to think about Black bodies a certain way. And here I'll mention another sociologist's book that's very illuminating. It's Osagie Obasegi's book, Blinded by Sight.
Blinded by Sight.
Blinded by Sight, a study of people who were born blind and how they see race. So even though they've never seen
race.
anyone, they've never seen race with, with their sight, they have been taught by their parents and others that one can see race. If they had sight, they would be able to see race. And his interviews produce all sorts of interesting insight into how parents teach their children. I've always said, well, I think parents teach their sighted children the same things. What it means to see a black body, what that means clearly is something that is taught and then creates these ways of thinking, or not creates, it perpetuates these ways of thinking about race as a biological essence that produces, social says, produces culture, produces health inequities, produces all of these differences in well-being that we see.
So I would just add, I think that the point you were making, Homie, about biological common sense, to me,
Yes,
that's
yeah.
simply a reflection of the work that race does in our society to make us think we have some biological
Exactly.
common sense.
Yeah.
That to believe that it is something that we all share, we all understand, there's no need for explanation, we all get it, a certain hair type, a certain nose shape, a certain physical shape, a certain skin color, even though you can look around this room and there are many, many skin colors of many, many people of different ancestries here. It doesn't matter because our quote unquote biological common sense tells us something else, right? And so that is the work that race has done, and that is the way in which, to me, race operates in a society that believes, and that belief has come about because these deeply sedimented practices that recreate and reform it over and over again, that there is something there to this biology that's called biology in any way.
And I love how you say belief. It's a belief. I more and more compare it to a religious belief, a faith. It's a faith about the biology. But I absolutely agree. It's grounded in a prior belief that then shapes what people see. It's so powerful. It's
very
so powerful.
Now has that
It might. I'm sorry, I can't see.
It's hard to see. There's a hand over here, but
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There's a hand. I looked that way. You have to look this way. You, sir.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I want to ask you both whether you think that scientists' unquestioned use of racial categories today may ironically be related to the, shall we say, ostensible acceptance that race is a social construct. Ostensible acceptance today that race is a social construct. So Jonathan Kahn, I think, put this more eloquently in his book, Race in a Bottle. As a merely social category, race does not command the attention in the life sciences with their focus on purportedly natural and objective phenomena.
yeah.
Hence, ironically, as biomedical researchers accept race as a social construct, they may also disavow, consciously or not, responsibility for rigorously interrogating the racial categories that they employ. Now, quickly, this may be a question better posed for tomorrow, since we're talking about scientists today. But I believe that we can see this point being made already in what you call the old biosocial. So, in response to Frank Livingstone in 1962, Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote that to say that mankind has no races plays into the hands of race bigots, to which Livingstone simply replied, I fail to comprehend how a position which denies the validity of a concept supports anyone using that concept.
Yeah. I think it is true that misunderstandings about what sociologists mean when they say race is socially constructed have supported the persistence of the biological concept of race in many ways, in ways you mentioned and in other ways as well. First of all, many people interpret race as a social construction to mean that the biological reality of race is socially constructed. So there is a real division of human beings that happened as a result of either God declaring it or evolution into identifiable races, and then that gets interpreted by different societies in different ways at different times. But they're constructing a real biologically distinct set of human beings. They're constructing what it means for human beings to be biologically separated into natural races. That also was clear in the interviews that Anne Morning did on college campuses, that many students were interpreting what their professors told them that way, but it's also emerging in the way in which conservative commentators are using new genomic research that some have interpreted as confirming the biological division of human beings into races. I won't get into how I don't believe it does confirm it, but they're taking that new science using new algorithms and computer methods and DNA databases to confirm that race is a biological reality, but it is merely constructed in society. Therefore, there's no need for government programs to take race into account. There's no need for affirmative action or reparations or any other kind of state redress for racial inequality, because that is just a social construction that we can debate whether we believe it or not. That's where they're making it sound like social construction is a belief, but the reality is that race is a real biological category. So again, but to me, that's a misinterpretation of what sociologists and others mean by race is socially constructed. Race is only socially constructed. It's not biological and socially constructed. It is only socially constructed. And maybe there's a need for all sorts of work in defining what race means and what social construction and the biological effects of race, all of that. It's really important for scientists and others to clarify what they mean by these categories and the way that they operate and the relationship between biology and racial inequality.
I see a couple of hands. Professor Bobo, is your hand up?
Sure. Hi. Thank you both for a terrifically provocative session so far. I look forward to more. I'm trying to draw together several questions, and I guess I'll put it this way. You've started to broach on it already, and it's part of the notes you started on, kind of why haven't advances in understanding the human genome eliminated the race concept? And kind of subsidiary to that is, and you've alluded to it now, that there are some people, very sophisticated people, and people who I think you would have a hard time classifying as problematic racists, vehemently advocating in favor of the basic Blumenbachian categories of races, like Neil Reich, that they believe they can prove to you that there are different vulnerabilities to illness, different vulnerabilities to certain types of outcomes that attach to our traditional geographic ancestry notions of the major racial groups. And so part of the question is, how do we disentangle that when someone who's got what looks like pretty good politics is aggressively advancing the scientific case for reinvigorating a notion of race.
Yeah.
Kind of related to that, I worry more about how the pursuit of scientism is leading many social scientists kind of really in an unreflective way to inadvertently embrace some pretty hard assumptions about racial distinctions. And so, you know, if you can get your big grant to get an MRI in the basement of your psych building and go, wow, everybody's afraid of black people, well, I don't know, you're half a step away from biologizing what the American brain is doing with its perception of these phenomena. And have you thought about the implications of doing that? You know? And so this is what really worries me in the current moment, that we haven't brought this level of sophistication to the discourse. And so the last troubling thought will be, my argument has always been, from this point forward, that you have to insist that people have a progressive race politics. And that if you don't, at the outset, declare that the purpose of what the beginning presumption is that race actually does not exist. We should have a world where there are not organized inequalities along these lines. We created them, they're going to be here for a while, they're hard to undo. Therefore, I have to use the concept, I can't escape it, but let's understand the end point is the elimination of this. Not through the John Roberts vehicle of, by ignoring it, it will go away, but through some, you know, much more forward-thinking, explicitly progressive logic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, why has it persisted? You're absolutely right that there are many, many scientists who are continuing to use a explicitly biological concept of race in their research, who claim that they can identify races from genetic databases, but most of that science begins with an assumption that races exist, and then they look for differences between them. And even the types of scientific maneuvers that group people by genetic similarity, they still import all sorts of assumptions in the way the DNA was collected, in the algorithms that they're using, in the numbers of groups they ask the computer to find, you know, just so many ways that many scientists don't see that they are importing these assumptions in every aspect of their work that claims to prove that race is a biological category. You're also right that the justification many use is that this is going to benefit minority people's health, and some even frame it as a social justice or civil rights kind of act to increase attention to minority health, to produce medications that are specifically for Black people and other groups of color, in order to redress prior neglect of minority health, and that this will help to end health inequities. And you're also right that sociologists are increasingly using these categories and tools without doing what sociologists are supposed to do, which is scrutinize how they're related, or at least scholars of science, the sociology and history of science people, but they're not so much. It's really the sociologists and anthologists who are doing this. Yeah, they're really doing this.
Historians of science do a much better.
They do. So this is something I think that we have to continue to push against. And what often this is, when I say something like, we have to push against it, or what you said, people will say, well, now you're being ideological. With this, we want to be more scientific. But it is more scientific to have definitions of the categories you're using and to think through the theories to justify why you are using certain categories. In many of these studies, there are all sorts of contradictions and just holes in the reasoning that need to be fixed. There are lots of reasons why I think it's going on. You suggested some of them. There is a financial incentive for getting funding if you have some kind of biological aspect to the project. And unfortunately, that biological aspect often is added without the kind of scrutiny that we've been talking about. Again, it's not to say that we shouldn't understand the relationship between biology and society. It's that the biological is often added without any scrutiny about what that relationship is, or I shouldn't say any scrutiny, enough scrutiny, and also questions about the values. Often the kinds of, the statement you made about having upfront a value of ending racial inequality, or a value of a way of thinking about human beings without dividing them into races, that is criticized, again, as political, as ideological, as if the old biosocial science weren't, from its origin to every single historical period that Evelyn talked about, completely influenced by the politics of the time. So it's not about, are we going to add value? Are we going to add ideology? It's what, again, expose it, and then how do we proceed in a way that promotes justice rather than hinders it?
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shields?
Yes. Hi. I want to try and raise a couple questions that I think address these methodological issues about the use of race constructs in genomics research, and I hope will also get us to the issue of distributive justice.
Yes.
So I'm thinking back to the first paper, an early paper that I and Evelyn and Pat King and Raina Rapp and Karen Lerman wrote in 2005 on the use of race variables in genomics research. And starting from back then, we critique the use of race variables in genomics research, the use of self-identified race variables in genomics research as a poor proxy for human genetic heterogeneity, okay? Now, I think that, and at that time, people were using 30 ancestry informative markers.
Yeah.
That's where the science was. Now we're doing whole genome-wide association studies. I think I want to put a challenge out there to those of us who are deeply committed to eliminating health disparities and our social scientists, okay? Population structure is real, okay? So to do a high quality genetic study, you need to account for population structure in your analyses. And population structure is due to, it tracks with geographical ancestry, right? Because of drift and intermarriage and mountain ranges that get in the way of people mating and so forth. So, deserts, right. So, people like Neil Risch, I mean, what they have shown, and with programs like Structure, you can actually use programs that group people in ways that are not biased and that will group people according to underlying population structure. And in many cases, those can overlap to a large degree, depending on your underlying samples, right?
Yeah,
The HapMap project, we had 74 Yoruba standing for all of Africa. Okay? You know, that was ridiculous.
Right.
But Sarah Tishkoff, for example, has done a lot of elegant work where she's had huge samples of self-identified African Americans. She's had many more samples of people of different parts of Africa, and shown that self-identified African Americans would range from 1% to 99% African ancestry according to different markers, right?
Yes.
So we know that there's the overlap is not what Neil Risch said it was
Right.
10 years ago.
Yes.
All right, so we know that
Right.
there's problems.
Yeah.
But we as social scientists can't be throwing out the baby with the bathwater and say that there's no population structure. So
Yeah.
it's not race, and we can talk about it in terms of geographical ancestry. And geographical ancestry will overlap with individuals' self-identified race or ethnicity to varying degrees,
Yeah.
right? So can we all be in agreement with that? Okay?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so what I think our challenge is in terms of doing research that may help, as a disparities researcher, what I want to do is I want to not have self-identified race in our statistical models as basically a sponge proxy variable for centuries of racism.
Right.
Okay, because when you find that that variable is significant, what you have is absolutely zero information that's informative, that gives you zero leverage for what to do to reduce that odds ratio that black folks are 10 times more likely to have diabetes or whatever it might be. It gives you zero information for action to reduce inequalities, okay? So we want to disaggregate that variable into here's population structure, and here is disproportionate exposure to these environmental assaults, these social situations, poor housing, inadequate access to healthy green vegetables, inadequate access to safe places to walk and get exercise, and so forth. We want to disaggregate that self-identified race variables into all the social and environmental exposures that disproportionately are visited upon black people in America because of social inequality. Then we have actually data that can inform interventions to improve the outcome. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but what you're doing is being much more careful about why you're interested in these populations, however you define them, in order to get data that will help answer a particular question. Okay, so those kinds of questions have been answered, as you know, historically, just by using, like the hypothesis I pointed to,
Right.
black race independent of other factors. Every part of that is so ambiguous.
It tells you
could mean,
absolutely
it tells
nothing.
you nothing. Okay, so you're absolutely right. You have to specify and think scientifically about what would answer the particular question you want, and self-identified race might help with certain, even though that could mean many different things as well, but that might help with some particular questions. A population structure might help with other kinds of questions. Maybe you need some combination of the two in order to answer another type of question. But I think what many of us are, and including yourself, are asking for is more careful thought about what these categories mean and why they are producing these disparate outcomes.
But I would argue that they're inappropriate for analyses investigating the etiology of disease. Self-identified race variables are inappropriate in those analyses. But to Larry's question, I think they're essential for monitoring health disparities because those are the socially meaningful groups in terms of monitoring health disparities and the health of different subpopulations. But I'd really be interested in hearing Steve's point of view in terms of the use of... Okay.
Oh yeah, he's introducing me tomorrow.
We don't need self-identified anything. Geneticists can, we study Sweden and one of the geneticists say, well, this guy has a Finnish grandmother. These are bad proxies for gene chips. And to Larry's point, eventually what you really want to know is, on this $30 gene chip, what are your risk variables? Have you visited a Russian prison because you're coughing, But let me just say one other thing. But what is really bizarre to me in all of this is that, and I don't know, 90% of human genetic diversity exists in Africa, right? So humans, hung out for 200,000 years, fructifying and diversifying, and then once or twice, maybe 50,000 people crossed from the Horn of Africa, a tiny little fraction of human genetic diversity. And then for African Americans, obviously, because of the behaviors of slave owners, there's all kinds of other, genetic admixture. So Neil Reisch is a great scientist, but I don't get the fetishization of this particular proxy for something that's medically important. And it should just go away. We're not quite there yet. We don't have the gene chips yet, but we will. It should just go away. Look, I come from a really bottleneck population, Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, we know it historically. We've got lots and lots of rare alleles, Tay-Sachs and this and that. African Americans are incredibly genetically diverse.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so there's a set of cognitive processes that, and historical processes and things that I think humanists and social scientists are in a better position to understand than scientists, that lead skin color or hair to be these, proxies for all kinds of things. And I agree with you that they don't actually stand in for it in any way. So there's a kind of cognitive impenetrability, even among physicians, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
They're taught to
they
take race into it. So it's preposterous to think that of black people as a homogeneous race that's separate from other groups of people because of all the genetic diversity in Africa, which is more, as Sarah Tishkoff has shown, more diversity within Africa than all the genetic diversity around the globe. Okay, so it's ridiculous to do that.
Unlike Africans, we do have some Neanderthal admixture.
That's
white
okay.
people, yeah. Some
So,
bad habits.
that could, but like I said, who's going to study that? But anyway, but
Somebody will.
in addition to all, what you geneticists like to call admixture, but, mixing of people throughout human history, okay, so especially in the United States. So it gets even more preposterous to call African Americans a race of people. Okay. But on the other hand, it is still the case that self-identified race represents the way, there's self-identified race is the way people identify you as well, which we should include. That may have even more to do with health disparities. But my point is the social grouping of race has an impact on health. So even if you know someone's genes, it's not going to give you the information about the way in which racism has structured so many aspects of their life that affect health. That's the reason why I'm resisting the idea that the social category of race or the political category of race is not, we can do away with it. It's not relevant to studying health inequities. Obviously it is, but it's not, we don't want, the way in which it's incorporated into medical practice, in some ways, I was thinking when you said things have changed, but there's certain aspects of medical practice that seem to come straight out of Samuel Cartwright's time.
But because I think we can talk about the debates that biologists and anthropologists were having, certainly in the early 20th century. Physicians were not involved in those conversations.
Yeah.
So that is a separate, in my view, a separate tradition that because of the way the conception of the body is always being shaped by culture and biology and culture working together was something that I think was a very prominent feature of their practice.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think you can look at the PubMed and see how far you can go into the 20th century and still see people characterizing their work by old racial categories of Caucasoid and Mongoloid and all of those. Goes very far in the 20th century, much further than people like to think.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to a different question, though, and that is the question of, I think one of the important things that happened, these debates have been great, They've really opened up for intellectuals and academics how to think about race as a social construction. But my concern is it also increased the gap between what people on the street understand, especially in the US context, and the academy.
Yeah.
A lot of people would sit here right now and say, yeah, you can say that all you want. I know it when I see it, and I know what it means when I see it, and I believe in it, okay? And that's something that's still, I think, so where do we go with that? As we get increasingly more sophisticated in how we talk about race in the academy, but just as Ann Morning showed, first, our students aren't quite getting it.
Even when they take a course on it.
Even when they take a course on it, but that happens with many things.
Yes.
But it does say to us as educators and those in the academy that we have a problem here. We're increasing a gap of understanding between how we talk about this, how we address questions of race in our work, and back to the sort of common popular notions of race that are continually repeated in the media, in social media, and by other sets of social practices. I'm concerned that we are not. These conversations, while I think incredibly useful, may not be closing that. And so,
well, I think that's true. And just to add to it, I think part of the reason why, Larry Bobo asked, why is it that this is so persistent in science? Part of it is because the scientists learned this as well when they were younger, and there is such a strong, it's almost hard to describe, but you can almost feel the resistance of many people in the academy of letting go of the idea that race is a natural division of human beings. So and doctors as well. They've learned this already before they get into the academy. So it's important for the academy, as well as the gap that may be increasing between the academy and other people on what they think about race. So, which means that, unfortunately, the research that is sequencing people's genomes and might show very definitively that you can't divide human beings by race. We have an alternative in genetics to grouping people by race. What impact is that really going to have, though, in the way that the politics in the United States is shaped? I find that people sort of latch onto the science to confirm what they want to see, and it presently hasn't had the kind of impact I think many people think it would have on the public. On the other hand, as we've seen, scientific theories have been able, like what we were talking about during the eugenics era, they have had a very powerful effect on social policy and culture and popular ideas as well. And I think this is a perennial question. How do we who are committed to social justice and envisioning another way of thinking about the relationship between human beings in a more equitable and humane way, how do we have an impact on the way that people who aren't in the academy think? Now, part of it, I think, is that there are lots of people outside the academy who are advocating for a more just and humane world. And I think more and more people in the academy need to hook up with people outside the academy to work on these. First of all, those people are closer to the grassroots. They're called grassroots organizations for a reason. They have more of an effect than we do in our institutions on how the popular culture imagines race, and everyday people imagine race and other aspects of our lives. So part of the answer, I think, is for not only more interdisciplinary work, not only between social scientists and biological sciences, but also people in the humanities, but also more work between people in the academy and those who aren't in the academy to put forth a better way of thinking about human beings, how we relate to each other.
There's one question here, and then Charles.
Hi, so I was
Oh,
actually
where is it?
class of 2016 in a
This way?
class taught by Professor Hammonds during my senior spring. So I just graduated and I'm currently doing an MSW program, and I'm working on an inpatient psychiatric unit, so I think a lot of my perspective and approach to this right now is very applied. And what I'm particularly interested in is, speaking of sort of like on the street sort of rhetorics of race right now, like the idea of like racial battle fatigue and racial trauma being something that's also being historicized. And so I guess my question is, how can we sort of responsibly be responding to the ideas that are sort of floating around in popular discourse of race and trauma, and then doing that in a way that doesn't necessarily biologize or presume trauma. For example, when patients come into my unit, how can we strike the balance of understanding the role of trauma, and I think the sort of historical understanding that we have of race, particularly as it interacts with the field of medicine and also sort of biological notions of it.
Yeah. Well, that's something I'm going to talk about more tomorrow, because I think what you're describing is more in the realm of the new biosocial, which recognizes that social inequality has traumatic effects on people's bodies. And I am concerned about how to study that, understand it, including the biological processes, without forgetting what caused the trauma. There's a tendency, as I'll talk about tomorrow, to then focus on what's in the body causing the trauma, as opposed to the practices that and institutions and systems that cause the trauma in the first place. And so, there are theories like post-traumatic slavery syndrome that describe the traumas that African Americans are experiencing today, but sometimes slip into making it seem as if they're the result of harms that took place centuries ago that have then been reproduced within the bodies of African Americans till today. That's very different from recognizing that there have been traumas inflicted since the time of slavery, through all the periods that Evelyn talked about, and that are currently being inflicted today. So I think the way this goes again to the relationship between what our bodies are experiencing in society, and I'm not sure exactly how to translate that into what a doctor does in the clinic, but I think it is important for doctors for part of their training, to think carefully about whether the trauma that their patient is experiencing is because of something innate in the patient, or whether it's because of something that's structurally unjust that's going on in the patient's life. There's a couple medical professors, Helena Hansen at NYU and Jonathan Mossell at Vanderbilt, and I've also co-authored an article with Jonathan Mossell on this topic of teaching medical students structural competency instead of cultural competency. Cultural competency tends to have medical students focus on what's different about their patients' lifestyles that is causing the problem, as opposed to the unequal social structures that are causing the problem. And I wrote an article called with Jonathan Mossell, Structural Competency Meets Structural Racism, where we do give some proposals at the end about what medical students and doctors can do to approach their patients from a structural perspective as opposed to a cultural or purely biological perspective.
Professor Rosenberg.
Late in the game to say anything.
Go right
But
ahead.
I did want to just reflect for a second on this word construction, which we keep using. And it's a very, this whole tension of this conversation in a way turns on the word construction, which has the implication of arbitrary. And arbitrary, in a sense, is lesser. I mean, and there's a tension between, you know, a hierarchy of epistemological legitimacy, in which biological is here, and the social is merely or just constructed.
Exactly.
And that's why biomarkers are so sexy in some ways, which Larry was talking about. And it's not a question really, it's just, I was just sitting here and I noticed that word kept being used. And in a sense, we are performing the social construction of race. As a group.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah, I think that's very, very true, that constructed is seen as less important, less powerful, having less authority than biologically determined. And so I could quote you, people who have made that distinction, that in order to support policies that are against affirmative action and focused more toward viewing race as a biological distinction and not a political category, where they make explicitly the distinction between race being a real biological aspect of human beings, but merely constructed. And so there's so much confusion about that word constructed. I think we really do need to think about another way of describing what we're talking about. You know, I used in my book, Fatal Invention, I used the word invent as another way, but I think we need to think about what these words mean, how they're being interpreted. But they certainly, the idea that race is socially constructed is being interpreted in a way that those of us who use it to describe the political meaning of race, the political invention, origins, maintenance of race, that it is an arrangement of power. It's a form of governance. We don't mean what many people think that socially constructed means.
But I think there's another piece.
Yeah.
That's a very important point. We
Yeah.
talk about the socially constructed, but I
Yeah.
also think there's an enormous confusion about what biology is.
Yes.
And so that's why I tried to turn to what Phil Polly described in his book about biology and American culture. They're always linked, this project of what is culture in the US context was something that the early leaders of American biology who were trying to professionalize it and give it a particular, this practice is a particular status among the sciences, were aware of by linking it to American life. Was doing a certain kind of work for them. So, but when people think of biology, it's the hard part, or it's this floor, and everything else is the constructed. And as opposed to something relational, or something that a set of practices that are continually reforming, or reframing, or tools, or presenting new tools that do different kinds of work that are linked to other kinds of tools. We're not, the biological is as unexamined as the constructed.
Right, that's
so
very true.
Everybody uses the word biological as if we understand what we mean, and we don't actually mean the same thing all the time.
That's very true. And it tends to mean for many people that it's deterministic. It determines something. That it can be separated from the social. So part of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow is the potential of the new biosocial framework to question what biology is. And how can we tap that potential to actually move toward a more just way of thinking about the relationship between biology and society. Fortunately, often the old definitions creep back in, and we're not taking advantage of this moment where we can rethink what biology even means, you know, what socially constructed means, and what are the relationships between the two. We're getting some
Professor
sense.
Sterling.
Yeah, just to throw a little more language in there, I mean, one of the ways I like to talk about the biology is to argue that, and particularly to talk about individual bodies that display some kind of disease that is seen more frequently in one group than another group, is to talk about the biological state or the medical state having been produced by social structures.
Yes.
So biology is not a given, but it's something that is produced by a set of a particular biological state is produced over time, as Pilar just whispered to me, developmentally, by a set of social forces. So that notion of producing bodies, I think, is an important way. I like it better than constructing, because constructing does have, in the metaphor, that notion of arbitrary. You could take boards and hang them vertically, or you could hang them horizontally. But bodies are produced in particular ways by their physiology interacting with the social structures which are affecting the physiology.
And that's revolutionary to think about it that way, as opposed to the old way of thinking. But how to take that and go with it is the question, I think.
Professor Baba gets the last word.
No, I don't want the last word. I want to just say that in talking about this notion of construction, something that we have not mentioned is the attractiveness of the stereotype. Why do people find stereotypes, even amongst oppressed people, they will construct their own stereotypes. That's my point about projection. Body image, the importance of visuality. In making the connection between science and the street, if I might put it that way. My function here is to thank you both very much, to thank the audience, and to look forward to tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Evelyn.